Some mornings in Africa begin in absolute silence, no drums, no speeches, just the soft rustle of fabric as women gather before sunrise. Mothers, grandmothers, and daughters sitting shoulder to shoulder carrying the weight of generations on their backs. That is the image that opened this gathering, hundreds of women from across the continent united, not by politics, but by something much deeper: responsibility, sacrifice, and an unbreakable hope that Africa can still rise with dignity. And into that room stepped President Ibrahim Traoré, not as a commander, not even as a head of state, but as a son speaking to his own mothers and sisters. Before he spoke of industry, agriculture policy, or reform, he spoke of pain of the kind that only women truly understand. The long nights of pregnancy, the struggle to feed a child when the world gives you nothing, the heartbreak of seeing young Africans wash ashore on foreign beaches because their homeland could not sustain them. This was not a political speech. It was a plea, a confession, and a call to something larger than any government: the awakening of Africa's women. Because Traoré believes, and many Africans now agree, that the future of the continent will not be built in military barracks or presidential palaces, but in the hands of women who know how to endure, how to heal, and how to build from nothing. Women who have the patience to nurture crops, the discipline to run factories, and the courage to unite communities torn apart by conflict. But here's the question that matters most. Can African women truly become the force that unites a divided continent and leads it toward real independence, economic, political, and spiritual? And perhaps an even bigger question for you watching from across the ocean: if Africa is changing, what role should America play in this new chapter? Stay with us. This story is deeper than headlines, richer than politics, and more hopeful than what the world is used to hearing about Africa. If you care about truth, real truth, hit subscribe. If you support the rise of African sovereignty through dignity and unity, share this message with someone today. When President Ibrahim Traoré finally took the stage at the Women's Forum, the hall was already filled with a quiet, almost sacred anticipation. Many of the women present had left their villages before dawn, some traveling on dusty roads, others balancing their children on their backs to sit in that room. They came not for ceremony, but for recognition. For decades, African women have been the backbone of their societies, yet they are rarely addressed with the respect or strategic importance they deserve. Traoré changed that from the very first moment. He did not begin with statistics or government achievements. Instead, he began with gratitude, deep, personal, almost intimate. He called them mothers and sisters, language that in Africa carries a weight beyond family ties. It means trust. It means reliance. It means acknowledging that progress itself is impossible without women. The women in the room straightened their backs as he spoke, many with tears gathering quietly at the corners of their eyes. They were not being lectured. They were being honored. Traoré then shifted toward the heart of his message: the true cost of Africa's delayed independence is paid by women first. He described the silent, painful moments that every African mother knows: the nights when a child cries from hunger and she has nothing left to give, the mornings when she must choose which child eats and which child goes without, the slow erosion of hope when her sons leave home to attempt the deadly crossing of the Mediterranean, believing that survival is more possible abroad than on African soil. The room became still. Many women lowered their faces into their hands. Some nodded, not in agreement, but in recognition, because these were not stories from a speech. These were pieces of their lives. Then came the turning point. Traoré made a declaration few leaders dare to voice publicly: Africa's greatest struggle is not against foreign powers, it is against its own internal divisions. This was not blame, it was truth. He spoke about how African nations often fail to speak with one voice, how jealousy, mistrust, and borders drawn by outsiders have kept communities apart. He emphasized that before Africa can stand up to external forces, it must heal internally. That healing, he insisted, must begin with women. He explained why women carry the emotional memory of a nation. They are the ones who hold families together when conflict erupts. They are the ones who soften hardened hearts, who can speak into places where men often refuse to listen. He reminded the audience that women, more than men, understand the meaning of survival, not just for themselves, but for an entire generation yet to come. The reaction was powerful. Some women placed their hands over their hearts, others whispered prayers. A few began to applaud softly, not out of excitement, but out of relief that a head of state was finally telling the truth that millions of African mothers already knew. From there, Traoré laid out the core message of the event: Africa cannot industrialize without women. He did not present them as assistants or supporters, but as the central engine of transformation. He spoke of agriculture, how women already grow most of the food in Africa. He spoke of manufacturing, how women are naturally patient and detail-oriented, capable of running complex processing units. He spoke of entrepreneurship, how women often use money more responsibly, ensuring it goes toward progress rather than personal indulgence. He described ongoing national programs designed specifically for women, access to land water processing facilities and training for value addition. These were not theoretical ideas, but active policies shaping Burkina Faso's new development model. His voice grew firmer as he emphasized the importance of rural women, the invisible majority who hold Africa's food systems together but rarely receive support. Finally, Traoré delivered the message that completed this historic moment: Africa's path to true independence will be led by women, not by chance, but by design. Industry, agriculture, unity, and peace all depend on the hands that have never stopped working, even when no one was watching. The hall erupted not loudly, but deeply. Women stood up, some wiping tears, some embracing each other, many whispering that for the first time they felt seen. And in their faces one could sense the beginning of something. Africa has long waited for a revolution built not on weapons or politics, but on dignity and purpose. The emotional peak of the gathering arrived the moment President Ibrahim Traoré spoke of Africa's greatest wound, one so painful that the room seemed to freeze around it. His voice softened, almost breaking, as he described the images the world has tried to ignore: African children, boys and girls, no older than 10 or 12, lying lifeless on foreign shores, washed up like discarded objects after drowning in the Mediterranean. They had fled, not because they wanted to leave their mothers, but because hunger and hopelessness pushed them into the sea. As he spoke, the hall became utterly silent. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of shared grief. Many women lowered their eyes, unable to hold back tears. Some covered their faces with their shawls, overwhelmed by the memory of sons who left home and never returned, or daughters who whispered that they would rather risk death abroad than remain trapped in poverty at home. For a few seconds, it felt as though the entire continent was mourning inside that room. And Traoré did not use this moment to inspire pity. He used it to expose a truth that hit harder than any political accusation: Africa is not failing because of foreign enemies alone. It is failing because Africans have not yet learned to stand together. He declared that the first barrier to Africa's rise is not imperialism, but internal division. A division that runs through tribes, borders, languages, religions, and even families. A division that prevents cooperation, dilutes strength, and makes unity nearly impossible. This was the real climax of his speech, the moment he named the enemy hidden in plain sight. Africa does not speak with one voice, he said. And because of that, we cannot protect our children, our resources, or our future. The reaction was immediate and deep. Some women shook their heads slowly, not in denial, but in painful agreement. Others whispered to one another, repeating his words as if they were hearing a confession long overdue. For decades, African leaders avoided acknowledging this truth publicly. But here, in a hall full of mothers, Traoré laid it bare. It was then that he turned toward a more hopeful revelation: women are the only force powerful enough to break these divisions. He explained that men, governments, armies, institutions can negotiate treaties and pass laws, but only women can repair the emotional fabric of a nation. Women can soften hardened hearts. Women can stop conflicts before they explode. Women can speak truth in ways that men are forced to hear. The room stirred. Several women began nodding strongly, their expressions shifting from sorrow to determination. A few were murmuring prayers under their breath, the kind of prayers African women make when they feel called to something larger than themselves. Traoré pressed further, describing scenes from conflict zones across the Sahel. He spoke of villages where women walked into tense gatherings of armed men and demanded peace not with weapons, not with force, but with the authority of motherhood. Men who would not listen to soldiers found themselves listening to mothers. Hearts that would not yield to governments found themselves softening under the voices of women who had buried their sons. This struck the audience like a spark. Several women stood up, hands raised, murmuring words of agreement. A few cried openly. One elderly woman in the front row lifted her walking stick high in the air, shaking it with pride as the room erupted in applause, a deep applause that came not from excitement, but from recognition that their power had finally been named. The climax was complete when Traore announced that women must become the architects of Africa's unity, not advisors, not assistants, architects. The foundation of industry, agriculture, peace, and political stability would rest in their hands. He urged them to carry this message to every village, every city, every border. He asked them to be ambassadors of unity, reminding them that when women speak with one voice, entire nations follow. The hall responded not with chaos, but with a disciplined, rising energy like a tide-gathering strength. Women embraced one another. Some pledged right there to return to their communities and begin organizing. Others stepped forward to thank Traore, telling him he had spoken the truth they had carried silently for years. This was no longer just a speech. It had become a turning point, a moment when African women were not only acknowledged, but commissioned. And the reaction made one thing clear: a continent that unites its women is a continent that cannot be stopped. The civil and political consequences of President Ibrahim Traoré's message extend far beyond the walls of the conference hall. When he spoke about empowering women, he was not introducing a symbolic gesture or a motivational slogan. He was outlining a national restructuring plan. And in Burkina Faso, this restructuring is already transforming daily life, especially for the rural women who have lived for decades in the shadows of policy. Across the countryside, in villages scattered between dry fields and long-forgotten roads, women are beginning to feel the impact of new government programs designed specifically for them. Many of these women have spent years bent over the earth from sunrise to sunset growing food, with almost no support, no machinery, and no market access. They are the invisible backbone of Africa's food system, feeding millions, yet receiving nothing but exhaustion in return. Traoré's administration has begun changing this reality. In several provinces, the government has created new agricultural zones reserved for women, giving them access to fertile land for the first time in their lives. These are not symbolic plots. They are real productive fields supported by irrigation networks and community wells. For women who used to walk miles just to fetch water, the arrival of a working borehole feels like a miracle. The reaction has been profound. Older women, many in their 60s, speak of the relief of finally being treated as producers rather than burdens. Younger women talk about pride, about the possibility of building a business instead of surviving one day at a time. But the civil impact goes deeper. Processing centers are being built near farming communities, so women can turn raw produce into marketable goods: tomato paste, dried fruit flour, shea butter, and other essentials. At these centers, women wear protective uniforms, operate machines, and participate in value chains that once belonged only to foreign companies. The transformation is visible in their posture. Women who once stood timidly now walk with their shoulders back, discussing prices, targets, and distribution routes. Their sense of importance grows with each passing day. Politically, the shift is even more significant. By empowering women economically, Traoré is building a new power base, one rooted in stability, responsibility, and community networks. Women are less likely to divert funds, less likely to engage in corruption, and more likely to reinvest profits into family welfare and local development. This creates a political environment where progress becomes measurable and trust becomes possible. Local chiefs and administrators, many of whom once dismissed women as mere caretakers, are now forced to adjust. They are seeing women deliver actual results: higher yields, organized cooperatives, and cleaner accounting than many established male-led enterprises. This is creating subtle but important political pressure, gradually reshaping community leadership structures. Women are being invited into meetings they were once excluded from. They are being asked for advice, for strategy, for partnership. For many, this recognition feels like a long overdue acknowledgement of their humanity. There is also a security dimension to all of this. In regions affected by extremist violence, women's economic empowerment is becoming a tool of stabilization. Women-led cooperatives create jobs for young men who might otherwise be vulnerable to recruitment by armed groups. Women moderating disputes between families prevent the kind of small grudges that often escalate into larger conflicts. And in villages where women start thriving businesses, the community becomes less dependent on traffickers, smugglers, or criminal networks. The emotional effect of these changes is equally powerful. For the first time in years, many women feel hopeful. Hope is not an abstract word in Africa, it is a resource. It is the difference between staying and fleeing, between planting and giving up, between peace and desperation. When women have hope, entire families reclaim their will to fight for a better future. And that is why Traoré's message resonates not only as policy, but as transformation. The empowerment of women is reshaping Burkina Faso's civil fabric, redistributing political influence, and building the foundation for a more united, more resilient nation. A country that strengthens its women, strengthens its future. To understand the meaning of Ibrahim Traoré's message from an American perspective, especially for those who lived through the most defining decades of the 20th century, one must look beyond Africa's borders and examine what this awakening represents in global terms. Because this is not just an African story, it is a shift that the entire world, including the United States, will eventually have to respond to. For many Americans over 60, the image of women rising to rebuild a nation is not unfamiliar. During World War II, when thousands of American men were deployed overseas, it was women who stepped into factories, shipyards, and supply lines. Rosie the Riveter was not just a poster, she was the symbol of a country that refused to collapse under pressure. Women kept the engines running, kept production moving, and ultimately played a silent but decisive role in the Allied victory. Traoré's message echoes this, almost as if history is repeating itself on another continent. In the civil rights era, too, American women, especially black women, were the quiet generals behind the movement. They organized the marches, fed the protesters, protected the children, and created the emotional shield that allowed the movement to survive. They were the moral spine of the struggle. When Traoré described African women as healers, unifiers, and the ones who speak truth in ways men cannot ignore, it is a sentiment that many older Americans will recognize from their own living memory. From a global perspective, the world has long viewed Africa as a space of dependency, dependent on aid, dependent on loans, dependent on external solutions. But the tone is changing. As women enter the industrial and entrepreneurial space, the foundation of that dependency begins to crack. No nation becomes independent until it can feed itself, manufacture for itself, and negotiate from a place of strength rather than desperation. And Americans who remember Japan's rise in the 1960s, South Korea's transformation in the 1980s, or China's awakening in the 1990s, understand very well that industrial revolutions often begin quietly and then transform the world suddenly. For the United States, this shift presents both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is clear. Africa is no longer content with one-sided partnerships. It is no longer satisfied with handouts. A continent that empowers its women, builds its industries, and unites its people becomes a continent that demands respect, not pity. This may require a new foreign policy approach, one that recognizes sovereignty rather than managing dependence. But the opportunity is far greater. A stable, self-sufficient Africa can be one of America's strongest partners. A partner in global supply chains, a partner in security cooperation, a partner in technological development, and a partner in climate resilience. For older Americans who lived through the Cold War, it is striking to see Africa now asserting its own voice rather than being pulled between superpowers. Traoré's emphasis on unity, dignity, and internal strength is a sign that Africans are no longer asking the world for permission to rise, they are simply rising. And perhaps the most important part of this transformation is that it is being led by women, not armies, not corporations, not foreign interests. Women who understand sacrifice, who know how to build, who have carried their nations through every crisis with little acknowledgement. For the world, this is a shift worth watching. For America, it is a signal to rethink old assumptions. For Africa, it is the beginning of a new historical chapter, one written in the steady, determined hands of its women. As the forum drew to a close, there was a lingering stillness in the air, one that felt less like an ending and more like the quiet beginning of something far larger. You could see it in the way the women stood together, some holding hands, others silently nodding at one another. They had arrived as participants, but they were leaving as carriers of a mission that stretched far beyond the walls of the hall, far beyond Burkina Faso, and deep into the heart of the African continent. President Ibrahim Traoré's final words were not the triumphant declarations of a politician. They were the sober warnings of a leader who understands just how fragile this moment of awakening truly is. He reminded the audience that Africa's greatest enemies are not always the visible ones. Hunger, disunity, and hopelessness can destroy a nation more quickly than any foreign power. He urged the women to stay vigilant, to keep speaking, keep building, keep pushing for unity in homes, in villages, in markets, and in the places where conflict still threatens to tear communities apart. For the American viewer, especially those who have lived through decades of global change from Vietnam to the fall of the Berlin Wall, from the civil rights movement to the digital revolution, Traoré's warning resonates with familiar echoes. Every great transformation in history comes with a moment where everything is still delicate, where a single misstep can erase years of progress. Africa is standing in that moment right now. A continent with the youngest population on Earth could rise into a new era, or it could fall once again into the cycles that have held it back for generations. And that is why the role of women is so critical. They are not simply being encouraged to participate, they are being asked to anchor the transformation, to steady the continent as it steps into an uncertain but hopeful future, to serve as both the emotional compass and the practical engine of industrialization, unity, and peace. If they succeed, Africa succeeds. If they fall, Africa falls with them. But the question remains, and it is a question that only time can answer. Are President Ibrahim Traoré's reform strategies enough to turn intention into reality? And even more importantly, can the African people continue trusting him to lead this transformation? Or will another voice eventually need to rise beside, or even in place of his "your thoughts matter," especially if you have lived long enough to recognize the turning points of history? If you believe Africa deserves the chance to rise on its own terms, let your voice be heard below. If you feel that women have always been the quiet architects of every great nation, share this video with someone who needs reminding. And if you want to stay with us as we uncover the truth behind Africa's new era, truth beyond headlines, beyond speculation, then subscribe. Because the world is changing, Africa is rising, and you deserve to see the story unfold as it truly is.